Hello there, friends. It's Miss Stephanie from the Chester Public Library, and it's time for our final virtual read aloud book club of the BFG by Roald Dahl. If you've been here the whole time, congratulations, you made it to the end. And if you're just tuning in for the first time, this is going to spoil the whole book since it's the last few chapters. So you're going to want to go back and listen to all the other segments first, because we're about to finish the book today and you might be a little confused. So here is the ending of the BFG by Roald Dahl. We left off at the plan. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force stood at attention beside the Queen's breakfast table. Sophie was still in her seat and the BFG was still high up on his crazy perch. It took the Queen only 5 minutes to explain the situation to the military men. "I knew there was something like this going on, Your Majesty," the head of the army said. "For the last 10 years, we've been getting reports from nearly every country in the world about people disappearing mysteriously in the night. We had one only the other day from Panama." "For a hearty taste," cried the BFG. "And one from Wellington, in New Zealand," said the head of the army. "For a booty flavour." "For a booty flavour," cried the BFG. "What is he talking about?" said the head of the Air Force. "Work it out for yourself," the Queen said. "What time is it?" 10 a.m. In 8 hours, those 9 bloodthirsty brutes will be galloping off to gobble up another couple of dozen unfortunate wretches. They must be stopped. We must act fast. "We'll bomb the blighters," shouted the head of the Air Force. "We'll mow them down with machine guns," cried the head of the army. "I do not approve of murder," the Queen said. "But they are murderers themselves," cried the head of the army. "There's no reason why we should follow their example," the Queen said. "Two wrongs don't make a right." "And two rights don't make a left," cried the BFG. "We must bring them back alive," the Queen said. "How?" the two military men said together. "They're all 50 feet high. They'd knock us down like 9-pins. "Wait!" cried the BFG. "Hold your horseflies. Keep your skirts on. I think I has the answer to the maiden's hair." "Let him speak," the Queen said. "Every afternoon," the BFG said, "all these giants is in the land of Noddy." "I can't understand a word this fella says," the head of the army snapped. "Why doesn't he speak clearly?" "He means the land of Nod," Sophie said. "It's pretty obvious." "Exactly," cried the BFG. "Every afternoon all these 9 giants is lying on the ground snoozling away in a very deep sleep. They's always resting like that before they's galloping off to guzzle another helping of human beings." "Go on," they said. "So what?" "So what you soldiers has to do is creep up to the giants while they're still in the land of Noddy and tie their arms and legs with mighty ropes and wonking change." "Brilliant," the Queen said. "That's all very well," said the head of the army, "but how do we get the brutes back here? We can't load 50-foot giants onto trucks. Shoot them on the spot, that's what I say." The BFG looked down from his lofty perch and said, this time to the head of the Air Force, "You is having belly poppers, is you not?" "Is he being rude?" the head of the Air Force said. "He means helicopters," Sophie told him. "Then why doesn't he say so? Of course we have helicopters." "Whoopsie big belly poppers," said the BFG. "Very big ones," the head of the Air Force said proudly, "but no helicopters big enough to get a giant like that inside it." "You do not put him inside," the BFG said. "You sling him underneath the belly of your belly popper and carry him like a perdido." "Like what?" the head of the Air Force said. "Like a torpedo," Sophie said. "Could you do that, Air Marshal?" the Queen asked. "Well, I suppose we could," the head of the Air Force admitted grudgingly. "Then get cracking," the Queen said. "You'll need 9 helicopters, 1 for each giant." "Where is this place?" the Air Force man said to the BFG. "I presume you can pinpoint it on a map." "Pinpoint?" said the BFG. "Map? I've never hearing these words before. Is the Air Force been talking slush bungle?" The Air Marshal's face turned the color of a ripe plum. He was not used to being told he was talking slush bungle. The Queen, with her usual admirable tact and good sense, came to the rescue. "BFG," she said, "can you tell us more or less where the giant country is?" "No, Majesty," the BFG said. "Not on my Nelly." "Then we're jiggered," cried the Army General. "This is ridiculous!" cried the Air Marshal. "You must not be giving up so easily," the BFG said calmly. "This first titchy obstacle you meet and you begin shouting, you is biff squeakled." The Army General was no more used to being insulted than the Air Marshal. His face began to swell with fury, and his cheeks blew out until they looked like two huge ripe tomatoes. "Your Majesty," he cried, "we are dealing with a lunatic. I want nothing more to do with this ridiculous operation." The Queen, who was used to the tantrums of her senior officials, ignored him completely. "BFG," she said, "would you please tell these rather dim-witted characters exactly what to do?" "A pleasure, Majesty," the BFG said. "Now listen to me carefully, you two boot bogglers." The military men began to twitch, but they stayed put. "I's not having the foggiest idea where Giant Country is in the world," the BFG said, "but I's always able to gallop there. I's galloping forthwards and backwards from Giant Country every night to blow my dreams into little children's bedrooms. I's knowing the way very well, so all you is having to do is this. Put your 9 big belly hoppers up in the air and let them follow me as I'm galloping along." "How long will the journey take?" the Queen asked. "If we's leaving now," the BFG said, "we will be arriving just as the Giants is having their afternoon snuzzle." "Splendid," said the Queen. Then, turning to the 2 military men, she said, "Prepare to leave immediately." The head of the army, who was feeling pretty miffed about the whole business, said, "It's all very well, Your Majesty, but what are we going to do with the blighters once we've got them back?" "Don't you worry about that," the Queen told him. "We'll be ready for them. Hurry up now, off you go." "If it pleases Your Majesty," Sophie said, "I should like to ride with the BFG, to keep him company." "Where will you sit?" asked the Queen. "In his ear," Sophie said. "Show them, BFG." The BFG got down from his high chair. He picked Sophie up in his fingers. He swiveled his huge right ear until it was parallel with the ground. Then he placed Sophie gently inside it. The heads of the Army and the Air Force stood there goggling. The Queen smiled. "You really are rather a wonderful giant," she said. "Majesty," the BFG said, "I was wishing to ask a very special thing from you." "What is it?" the Queen said. "Could I please bring back here in the belly poppers all my collection of dreams? It's taken me years and years to collect, and I'm not wanting to lose them." "Why, of course," the Queen said. "I wish you a safe journey." Next chapter, Capture! The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from Giant Country over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this, with 9 huge helicopters roaring all along over just over his head. He had never before traveled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to, but this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. Every now and then, the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marveled at the giant's speed and at the way he leapt across wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. "Be careful to hang on tight," the BFG said. "We's going fast as Fizzlecrump." The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip, and jumper with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realized they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. "Where the devil are we going?" he cried. "I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy mustache. He was very proud of his mustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. "It's fun going to new places," he said. "New places?" shouted the head of the Air Force. "What the blazes do you mean, new places?" "This place we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it?" pilot said, grinning. You're darn right it isn't in the atlas, cried the head of the Air Force. We've flown clear off the last page. I expect that old giant knows where he's going, the young pilot said. He's leading us to disaster, cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified. You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the atlas, he cried, leaning forward to look. It's exactly what I am telling you, cried the Air Force man. Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went off that over an hour ago. He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end. So now we must be somewhere here, he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. Where's here? Cried the head of the army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, That's why they always put 2 blank pages at the back of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself. The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. Just look at this godforsaken desert, he cried. All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue. The giant has stopped, the young pilot said. He's waving us down. The pilots throttled back the engines and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, 1 from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. I don't see any giants, the head of the army said. The giants is all just out of sight over there, the BFG told them. But if you're taking these slosh-buckling, noisy belly poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel. So you want us to proceed by jeep? The head of the army said. Yes, the BFG said, but you must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery-jokery. The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful, rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face. Those are guns, he cried. There's a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Let's get out of here. Pig spiffle, the BFG said. Those noises is not guns. Of course they're guns, shouted the head of the army. I'm a military man and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back. Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep, the BFG said. I's a giant myself and I know a giant snortle when I's hearing one. Are you quite sure? The army man said anxiously. Positive, the BFG said. Proceed cautiously, the army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50 feet long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep. And the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. The BFG raised his hand. The jeeps all stopped. The soldiers got out. What happens if one of them wakes up? Whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say "Nakjive," the BFG answered, grinning hugely. Me's the only one that won't be gobbled because giants has never eaten giants. Me and Sophie's the only safe ones because I's hiding her if that happens. The head of the army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. Go forward, men, the head of the army said. Go forward and do your duty bravely. The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. None dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood nearby watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked beneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny, piggy, black eyes. "Which of you foul bastards is wiggling my arm?" he bellowed. "Is that you, you ransom man-hugger?" Suddenly, he saw the soldiers. In a flash, he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons on them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. "Human beings!" the flesh lump eater yelled. "What is all you flesh-bunking ransom half-baked beings doing in our country?" He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand. "I's having early suppers today," he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching horror-struck. "Do something," she cried. "Quick, before he eats him!" "Put that human being down!" the BFG shouted. The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG. "What is you doing here with all these cracky twiglets?" he bellowed. "You's making me very suspicious." The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm to the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must! She must! She remembered the sapphire brooch the queen had pinned to her chest. Quickly, she undid it. "I is guzzling you nice and slow," the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. "Then I's guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You's not getting away from me because I is galloping 50 times faster than you." Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her two fingers. When she was standing right up close to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch-long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. "You was bitten by a snake," he shouted. "I see it biting you." "It was a frightsome poisonous viper. It was a dreadly thunderous windscreen viper." "Save our souls!" bellowed the flesh lump eater. "Sound the crumpets! I is bitten by a septicus venenum windscreen viper." He flopped to the ground and sat there howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. "The teeth of the deadly viper is still sticking to me," he yelled. "I's feeling this teeth sticking into my anklet." The BFG saw his second chance. "We must be getting those viper's teeth out at once," he cried. "Otherwise, you is better than duck soup. I's helping you." The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. "You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands," he ordered. "That will stop the poisonous juices from the venom viper going up your leg and into your heart." The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. "Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I's taking out the teeth of the venomous viper," the BFG said. The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope. The soldier rushed over to him. With both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together in a tight knot. "I's pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. "Do it quickly," shouted the flesh lump eater, "before I is pissing to death." "There we is," said the BFG, standing up. "You can look now." When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell, so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. "Well done, you!" Sophie cried. "Well done, you!" said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. "You is saving all of our lives." "Will you please get that brooch back for me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during the schmozzle. "When you's only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you's sleeping extra doubly deep," the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," the head of the Army said. "I shall probably get a medal. What is the next move?" "Now you's all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams," the BFG said. We can't waste time with that rubbish," the Army general said. "It is the Queen's order." "It is the Queen's order," Sophie said. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave, and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. "What's that you've got in there?" the head of the army demanded to know. "Curiosity is killing the rat," the BFG said, and he turned away from a silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, "Now, we're driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants." The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. There was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by terrific thundering of the engines overhead, and the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. "I is flesh bungled," roared the flesh lump eater. "I is split wiggled," yelled the child chewer. "I is swog swalloped," bellowed the bone cruncher. "I is goose groggled," howled the man hugger. "I is gizzled swiped," shouted the meat dripper. "I is front goggled," screamed the maid masher. "I is slop groggled," squawked the gizzard gulper. "I is crowd swinkled," yelled the blood butler. "I is bop muckered," screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giant-carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks on the ends of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giant's chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then, very slowly, the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned out by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on the powerful searchlights and trained them on the galloping giant so as they could see him at night. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. Our next chapter, feeding time. When the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on back home in England. Every earth digger and mechanical contrivance in the country had been mobilized to dig the colossal hole in which 9 giants were to be permanently imprisoned. 10,000 men and 10,000 machines working ceaselessly through the night under powerful arc lights, and the massive task was completed only just in time. The hole itself was about twice the size of a football field and 500 feet deep. The walls were perpendicular, and engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in. Even if all 9 giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, the topmost giant would still be some 50 feet from the top of the hole. The 9 giant-carrying helicopters hovered over the massive pit. The giants, one by one, were lowered to the floor, but they were still trussed up, and now came the tricky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down to do this, because the moment a giant was freed, he'd be sure to turn on the wretched person who had freed him and gobble him up. As usual, the BFG had the answer. "I told you before," he said. "Giants is never eating giants, so I's going down, and I shall untie them myself before you can say Rack Robinson." With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peering down onto the pit, the BFG was lowered onto a rope. One by one, he released the giants. They stood up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and started leaping about in fury. Why is they putting us down here in the gob-sludging hole?" they shouted at the BFG. "Because you's guzzling human beings," the BFG answered. I's always warning you not to do it, and you's never taking the titchiest bit of notice. In that case, the flesh lampeter bellows, I think we's guzzling you instead. The BFG grabbed the dangling rope and was hoisted out of the pit just in time. The great bulging sack he had brought back with him from Giant Country lay at the top of the pit. What's in there? What's in there? The Queen asked him. The BFG put an arm into the sack and pulled out a gigantic black and white striped object the size of a man. Snozzcumbers, he cried. This is the repulsant Snozzcumber, Magister, and that is all he's going to give these disgusting giants from now on. May I taste it? The Queen asked. Don't, Magister, don't, cried the BFG. It is tasting of trog filth and pig squeeble. With that, he tossed the Snozzcumber down into the giants below. There's your supper, he shouted. Have a munch on that. He fished out more Snozzcumbers from the sack and threw them down. The giants below howled and cursed. The BFG laughed. It serves them right, left, and center, he said. What will we feed them on? What will we feed them on when the Snozzcumbers are used up? The Queen asked him. They are never being used up, Magister, the BFG answered, smiling. I's also bringing in this sack a whole bundle of Snozzcumber plants, which I's giving, with your permission, to the royal gardener to put in the soil. Then we's having an everlasting supply of this repulsant food to feed these bloodthirsty giants. What a clever fellow you are, the Queen said. You are not very well educated, but you are really nobody's fool. I can see that. Our last chapter, the author. Every country in the world that had in the past been visited by the foul man-eating giants sent telegrams of congratulations and thanks to the BFG and to Sophie. Kings, presidents, and prime ministers and rulers of every kind showered the enormous giant and the little girl with compliments and thank yous, as well as all sorts of medals and presents. The ruler of India sent the BFG a magnificent elephant, the very thing he'd been wishing for all his life. The king of Arabia sent them a camel each. The Lama of Tibet sent them a llama each. Wellington sent them 100 pairs of wellies each. Panama sent them beautiful hats. The king of Sweden sent them a barrelful of sweet and sour pork. Jersey sent them pullovers. There was no end to the gratitude of the world. The Queen herself gave orders that a special house with tremendous high ceilings and enormous doors should immediately be built in Windsor Great Park, next to her own castle, for the BFG to live in. And a pretty little cottage was put up next door for Sophie. The BFG's house was to have a special dream storing room, with hundreds of shelves in it where he could put his beloved bottles. What is more, he was given the title of the Royal Dream Blower. He was allowed to go galloping off to any place in England on any night of the year to blow his splendid fizz wizard in through the window to sleeping children. And letters poured into his house by the million from children begging him to pay them a visit. Meanwhile, tourists from all over the globe came flocking to gaze down in wonder at the 9 horrendous man-eating giants in the Great Pit. They came especially at feeding time, when the Snozzcumbers were being thrown down to them by the keeper, and it was a pleasure to listen to the howls and growls of horror coming up from the pit as the giants began to chew upon the filthiest tasting vegetable on earth. There was only one disaster. 3 silly men who had drunk too much for lunch decided to climb over the high fence surrounding the pit, and of course they fell in. There were yells of delight from the giants below, followed by the crunching of bones. The head keeper immediately put up a big notice on the fence saying it is forbidden to feed the giants, and after that, there were no more disasters. The BFG expressed a wish to learn how to speak properly, and Sophie herself, who loved him as she would a father, volunteered to give him lessons every day. She even taught him how to spell and to write sentences, and he turned out to be a splendid, intelligent pupil. In his spare time, he read books. He became a tremendous reader. He read all of Charles Dickens, whom he no longer called Dolph Chickens, and all of Shakespeare, and literally thousands of other books. He also started to write essays about his own past life. When Sophie read some of them, she said, "These are very good. I think perhaps one day you could become a real writer." "Oh, I would love that," cried the BFG. "Do you think I could?" "I know you could," Sophie said. "Why don't you start by writing a book about you and me?" "Very well," said the BFG. "I'll give it a try." So he did. He worked hard on it, and in the end, he completed it. Rather shyly, he showed it to the Queen. The Queen read it aloud to her grandchildren. Then the Queen said, "I think we ought to get this book printed properly and published so that other children can read it." This was arranged. But because the BFG was a very modest giant, he wouldn't put his own name on it. He used somebody else's name instead. But where, you might ask, is this book that the BFG wrote? It's right here. You just finished reading it. That was a nice little ending there, my friends, and that is the end of our virtual Read Aloud book club on Roald Dahl's The BFG. I hope you liked it. I had fun reading it. I wonder what your favorite part was. My favorite part was that the BFG spoke a little differently, but Sophie didn't mind. She thought it was interesting that he spoke a little different, and she helped explain to other people that the BFG was a little different, but that didn't have to matter. I liked that about Sophie, and I liked that Sophie saved the day in the end. So I want you to think about your favorite part of the book and share it with your friends and family, whoever's watching with you, and have a little chat about your favorite parts. Also, what did you think of the ending? Do you think it was a good plan for them to put all the giants in the pit? And do you think it was a good idea that the Queen gave the BFG and Sophie houses next to hers? Think about those things and chat about them with your family and friends. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us for our virtual Read Aloud book club. I had a great time. I hope you did too. And I'm not sure if we're going to do another one, but if we do, I'll be sure to let you know. So stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks for joining me.